If anyone has any questions during it, just please type them in. We'll also have questions at the end of the presentation as well, so don't be shy to type those in. So for now, thanks again to Greg from Canadian Sport Institute to give us another presentation during these challenging times in terms of helping us to learn methods to stay active, stay healthy, and do our strength and conditioning from home. So I'll turn it over to you, Greg, and I'll mute my microphone.
All right, thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on this during this presentation. I hope everyone is safe. The weather is starting to get a little bit nicer, so road season, isolated road season, is close for most of us. So this presentation, I'm going to build off of my previous one. So if you did not see that one, it'd be good to go back and reference it, because I'm going to build on some of those concepts. One of the first presentation I gave, I predominantly focused on just strength training in terms of looking at it from key foundational movements that we could do within our training program with minimal equipment. And I kind of brushed really quickly over the core. But today I really want to dive into the core and the importance of core training for the cyclist. And again, this is stuff that you could do with minimal equipment. When we're looking at the core, the core in itself, we need to really define what the core is. A lot of people look at the core a little bit differently, and even in scientific literature and papers, they'll define core a little bit differently as well. So for the purposes of today and the presentation, I'm going to define the core as the abdominal region. So looking at the obliques, the transverse, rectus abdominis. So that would be where I would label as abdominal region. The paraspinal, so those are the muscles that are running down on both sides of your spine. So those would be the erector spinae. So those sometimes get really inflamed and irritated with poor loading patterns or excessive loading. And the glutes, so the gluteal muscles. So what are them? So I define those three key gluteal muscles at the bottom there. They're all responsible for movement as well as balancing and controlling external loads that are applied to the trunk. So whether that is on the bike or just in everyday life, they do play a big role in terms of just controlling those loads on our body. When we're looking at the obliques, so those muscles running down the sides of our body, we're thinking about being able to stabilize from side to side. So again, if for example, you have weak obliques, not necessarily, but it could be a potential reason, and you're shifting from side to side on the saddle during hill climbs, that might be a reason for that. The glutes or the buttock muscles really power and stabilize the legs. So postures that target the main glutes include basic bridging, glute planks, and so forth, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper during the later parts of the presentation. And they're really big in terms of sequencing the forces, the power down to the pedaling, right? So we want to really think about the core as the link between what is happening with our upper body and what's happening with the lower body, because they do help a lot with force transfer, which leads me to my next point. So what is the function, what's the core function in cycling? So one, we have bike posture, so on and off the bike, which is super important. We got to look at thinking about just postures outside of cycling, because we don't spend the whole day on our bikes. So before I even dive into this, I really want to use an analogy. So if we think about the core, it's like our car's transmission. The engine produces the torque, but it's through the torque that the core is able to appropriately transfer it. So if the transmission, for example, is not functioning, so we have a weak link in the core somewhere, then our power output will be compromised. So for example, when you're climbing a hill and you're out of the saddle and you want to create torque through the legs and drive through the pedals, your body is creating the stability because you're pulling on the hands, and then that power, that force that you're using with your upper body is then transferred into the core, the glutes, and down to the pedal. Again, you really want to think about looking things holistically and how these play a role in just our general postures in everyday life, and then how they contribute to cycling performance. So if we're looking at power transfer, there's limited research in terms of how the core contributes to that. However, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that it does play a key role in our power transfer. So for example, if we're doing low cadence, big gear stuff on the bike, and our hips start to rock from side to side, which might lead to swaying, well, that could potentially be a reason for poor transfer into the pedal. And most riders will lose significant pedal power because of some of that weak or low back weakness. And as a result, our body is a master of compensating. So for example, if we're not using the core in its way that's supposed to be used, then we're overloading muscles that are not supposed to be doing overloading muscles that are not the main movers of that movement. So for example, if our glutes are not used effectively, then we might overload our lower back, which might lead to injury. So generally speaking, the stronger the muscles around the joint are, the more stable the joint will be. And this greatly diminishes the risk for injury. And then again, it goes hand in hand with bike posture. Hello? It really goes hand in hand with bike posture. And if we're in poor postures due to weaknesses, then we will predispose ourselves into areas that will potentially lead to injuries, specifically in the hip, knee, and low back region. So when we're looking at the types of stability, we can really break it down into static and dynamic. So static stability is being able to hold body positions in a static environment, which if we're looking at the upper body and specifically in a TT position, we don't want any swaying in the upper body, right? It has to be like rock solid. So then we're creating static stability through there. However, dynamic stability is being able to maintain that while maintaining body positions during motion. So cycling is predominantly, it's going to be some static, but then there's going to be a lot of dynamic stability that's going to be involved in it as well. So for example, when we're transitioning from seated to standing, a stable core will keep the torso in the same plane. So we're not going to have those shifting from side to side. If the hips start moving from side to side during this transition, that might mean that there might be some strength deficits going on somewhere. Again, the core really interplays with just stability on the bike, and then how we look and the environment that we create for ourselves. So when we look at static stability, what does that look like in terms of just movements? Well, play a quick video here. So simply a static stability, we have a plank. Again, core's not moving, nothing is moving. I'm resisting motion. How could we make that a little bit more dynamic? Well, we could just do that by moving our legs. So again, static and dynamic stability, and I'm going to touch upon a little bit more in detail further down during the presentation, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like in terms of training. Again, the real thing with dynamic stability, Well, if we're doing a step up, that is going to be dynamic stability, right? Because we're stepping up, we have to brace ourselves so we're not falling over. So there is, that's our big dynamic stability. So movement in itself is dynamic. When we're looking at core training, we want to think about planes of motion. I'm not gonna go deep into this, but generally speaking, a lot of people, when they think about, when they do core strengthening, they're just looking at it from this perspective of the sagittal plane. Now, what does the sagittal plane mean? Well, sagittal plane is any sort of stability front to back. So for example, a plank, or a plank will be a sagittal plane core stabilizing movement. However, when we're thinking about sport in itself, it's not just done in one plane. It's done in all three planes. So when we're looking at transverse plane, well, that's anything to do with rotational movement. So that could mean resisting, that could also mean resisting rotation. And we'll go into a little bit deeper on what these exercises might look like in our later slides. And with frontal plane, so that's anything to do from side to side. So anything like if you're looking in the mirror, so bending from side to side, that's done in the frontal plane. So you'll be able to see that movement in the mirror. So for example, like a jumping jack is done in the frontal plane. A specific core exercise done in the frontal plane is a side plank. So when we're thinking about core training, we're thinking about trying to target all these planes of motion, because that is what's going to create this robust core, which will help us in terms of power transfer, in terms of mitigating injury on the bike, and so forth. Again, sometimes defining where these core exercises fit into in terms of planes of motion, there's a lot of overlap, right? But again, it's more about thinking. How can we manipulate the exercises so that we're targeting all these planes. So going on. So transverse plane core stability. So some of you have probably seen this in my previous presentation. So what does that look like? So there's a band. So there's a band attached to an implement and I'm pressing out. So if I do not brace my core, I'm resisting rotation. If I do not brace my core when doing this exercise, so I'll play this video again. If I don't brace my core, right? So I'm resisting rotation. The band, my hands will go down, will go closer to where the band is attached to, okay? So when we're thinking about frontal plane core stability, so like I alluded to earlier, that might be a side plank, okay? So we're thinking about good postures, and we'll talk about what those good postures are later on. And then we have sagittal plane. So I already talked about the plank in itself, but a hip lift or a hip bridge is done in the sagittal plane as well. So again, there's various exercises and they fill different buckets in terms of planes of motion. So what are the keys to developing good core stability? Well, we want to think about hip alignment. So I'm going to play this video. So as I'm lifting my hands off the ground, if you notice, my hips are shifting from side to side. And we're thinking about stability. We want to limit that as much as possible. So something that a lot of times what happens is we rush through these core exercises and we're not actually developing the stability that we need that will help us on the bike. So there is a reason why technique plays a big role when we're looking at developing, when we're doing these exercises. So if I was to do, again, play this video, my hips are shifting from side to side, there should be no hip shift or no dropping at any point. When we're thinking about doing side planks, right? We want to make sure that there's a straight line from our heads all the way down to our heels, right? Again, that is a stable position. A non-stable position is when we have here in the bottom image, we get this curve. So we're not braced, we're not utilizing our core in the way that it's supposed to be utilized. So again, we're not training core stability. We're not maximizing the what we can from the exercise. Again, another thing that happens a lot within programs, and I see this a lot, is our low back. So we want to strengthen our low back, which is great. We want to strengthen the glutes, which is great. Here's a bird dog, which some of you may have seen. However, where we want to make sure low back integrity, right? This is not a stable back, right? We have excessive curvature happening through our lower back. We're putting excess pressure on our low back by putting it in these positions. What we want is a straight back from head to heel, right? I use a saying, from head to heel, strong as steel. So there should be a neutral gap between the line. So there's no excessive curve that's happening when we're doing these exercises. So it's really, really important when we're thinking about when we're doing these core exercises, the way that we're doing it, because that will have a big impact on how we're training and the impact it will have on us in terms of feeling on the bike. Another thing that doesn't get enough credit is breath. So breathing, right? By breathing, if we go back to my previous slide, we had a couple of abdominal muscles, one of them being the transverse abdominals. So this is what a lot of people call the deep core muscles. So this actually, when this movement is done correctly, as you'll see here, I'm breathing through my belly, not my chest, my belly. So I'll play that video again. It's rising through my belly, and there's a big exhale. So I'm thinking about blowing into a balloon. And what that does is it really activates the transverse abdominis, or those deep core muscles. And when done correctly, that exercise gets pretty hard. Generally speaking, a lot of people that have low back pain, which unfortunately happens a lot in a lot of cyclists, they're not able to do that. They're not able to breathe deeply. So focusing on the breath, focusing on strengthening those deep abdominal muscles will help with just postural alignment, which will help with alleviating some of that back pain. Again, there's lots more that go into terms of alleviating pain, but that's definitely one of those things. Here we can do like a simple trunk endurance test, right? So a lot of people say, oh yeah, I have a really good, strong, stable core. And sometimes what happens when they get into a plank position, they have a lot of hip shift happening. There's an excessive curvature in the lower back, which I showed with the bird dog example. And they're not doing the plank in its full integrity. So we want to look at what's happening at the hips. If the hips are dropping from side to side, looking at this, the line here. If we're going from head to heel, again, there should be a straight line. There should be no excessive lower back curvature happening at any point. So this study looked at, again, it was just a very, very simple study. In terms of like recommendations, I think there's a lot more to that than what they've recommended. However, it's a good baseline. If you can't hold a plank for 2 minutes with good integrity, so no sagging hips, no excessive arching or rounding of the lower upper back, and no hip drop from side to side. If you're able to hold that for at least 2 minutes, you're in a good spot. And if you can't, then we really need to focus on strengthening the core. If you're going for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on the back, and you can't hold the plank for 30 seconds, I think this is where core training could really help you with just posture, or just trying to alleviate some of the stress on the joints. So key core exercises, what are they? So like the previous presentation that I did, just let me bring up sorry. Like the previous presentation, I'm gonna try to share this actually with everyone. So give me a second here. So I have created a movement library for everyone with some simple progressions. Share. Okay. So I think everyone can see that. And what I'll do is more. Files. Sorry, everyone. Just going to try to upload this for everyone. Easier said than done. So if you guys want to go back and check the website later, Mike's going to upload this document for everyone to have at their disposal. Sorry about that. But I'll go through it really quickly so everyone could have an understanding of what this means. Again, this is minimal equipment. There's more to it than these exercises, but at least it gives you an idea of how can I target all these planes of motion? What kind of exercises can I do to really strengthen my core holistically? So I've created a YouTube link, and it's hyperlinked here. So if you could easily go to that YouTube link and look at all those exercises that I've defined here. But essentially what I've done is I've created a exercise progression continuum. So starting from level 1 and then all the way to level 3. And each exercise has a YouTube link that you could access. So again, going by those core principles, pun intended, of what it means to have structural integrity when we're doing these exercises, you're going to base movement, your exercise selection on that. So if we want to target the anterior core, so plank transverse, so that's would be in the sagittal plane, so the anterior core. These are some of the exercises that we could do. If we want to target some of the frontal core, so the lateral core, then these are some of the exercises we could do. So those are slide plank derivatives. And then when we think about our posterior core, well, again, there's different ways. So I talked a little bit about bird dogs. And then hip bridging. So all those exercises will target the posterior core. And then we have our rotational core as well. So again, each exercise will have its movement progression, and you could challenge yourself a little bit differently. And some of these exercises don't really fall into one, they kind of fall into multiple categories in terms of the planes of motions. For example, if we show what I showed with the plank where I was tapping my shoulder, that actually would be a rotational core exercise. Again, Mike's gonna upload this onto the website, so please go back and use this as a reference guide with all the links. And if you haven't done so, go back to my previous presentation about structuring a strength training program with minimal equipment, because I do give some sort of suggestive reps and set schemes that you could use for some of these exercises. So again, it really just depends on where you are within your training and what you have at your disposal. So I will stop sharing and I will open it up to any questions that some of you guys might have in terms of core training for a cyclist and how we can implement them during this period.
Just a reminder to type your question into the chat box if you have a question. All right, I'm not seeing any there, Greg. Thanks again for doing another presentation for us, and we'll be in touch hopefully to get something else up in the coming weeks. Thanks to everyone for attending. We will post this video later today as well, and we'll make sure the reference material gets up on our website. It'll be on the front page under the athlete webinar series section. Oh, looks like we have a question there, Greg.
Okay. Would you incorporate core training into the twice a week session or do a separate session? Great question. It really does depend. I like to, sometimes I program some of these core exercises, even though it's maybe 1 or 2 sets in warm-ups, for example, prior to jumping on the bike. I think it's really important to really stimulate and activate those muscles. So even before a session on going for a ride, include some planking, include some glute bridging, because I think that will also help setting the body in a good position for our rides. So you don't need to necessarily dedicate a full-on session, but you absolutely can just put it into dosing it over the course of the whole week. If you want to do another like a day where it's dedicated to just core, I don't see an issue with that. So you could have 2 sessions where you do it with that strength training sessions where I talked about previously, and do it on the 3rd day of just core training. But again, it just really does depend on your time and what you're really trying to get out of it. But I see no issues with doing another separate session or combining the 2, or just dosing it throughout the whole week. Perfect.
Great. See no other comments, Greg. Thank you again. And we'll have this material up later today. Thanks to everyone for attending. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll connect with everyone soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.